October 28th, 1981, 10 a.m. The Cold War was supposed to start with a siren. It was supposed to start with a red phone ringing in Washington or a radar blip in Moscow. Instead, it started with a confused fisherman in a rowboat. Ingvar Svensson and Bertil Sturkman were navigating the gray, treacherous waters of Gåsefjärden, a remote inlet in the Karlskrona archipelago of southern Sweden. They were locals. They knew these waters better than anyone. They knew where the rocks were. They knew where the herring ran. And they knew that this area was quiet. But as the mist lifted that morning, they saw something that physics said shouldn't be there. Wedged tight on the granite reef of Torhamneskär was a black steel mountain. It was 76 meters long, roughly the length of a modern Boeing 747-8, but silent, black, and smelling of diesel. It was covered in acoustic rubber and barnacles, and it was angry. The vessel's diesel engines were roaring at full throttle, churning the shallow water into a white, brown mud froth as the crew tried desperately to back the massive hull off the rocks. The smell of unburned diesel fuel hung heavy in the air. Sturkman cut his engine. He drifted closer. High up on the conning tower, a man was standing. He wasn't wearing a Swedish naval uniform. He was wearing the distinct drab uniform of the Soviet Navy. He was scanning the horizon with binoculars. Flanking him, shivering in the cold, was a young sentry gripping an AK-47. The barrel was pointed straight at the fisherman. This wasn't international waters. This wasn't a shipping lane. This was Gåsefjärden, a labyrinth of islands roughly 10 kilometers from Sweden's primary naval base at Karlskrona. This was a skyddsområde, a military protection area. In modern terms, a Tier 1 exclusion zone. A nuclear-capable Soviet submarine had just driven into the front lawn of the Swedish Navy, and it was stuck. The vessel was the Soviet S-363, but in Sweden it would become infamous under a different name, U-137. This is the story of the Whiskey on the Rocks incident. But this is not just a story about a bad driver. It is a story about a forensic hunt for nuclear weapons. It is the story of a high-stakes poker game played with machine guns and radar locks. And it is the story of how the Soviet Union's Sea of Peace was exposed as a lie. To understand why the Swedish government panicked, you have to understand the geography. Look at the map. The Karlskrona archipelago isn't the open ocean. It is a defensive fortress built by nature. It is a dense belt of rocky islands and shallow, treacherous straits. Navigating here requires a local pilot. You have to know the depths to within a meter. You have to know the currents. The S-363 didn't just drift here. To reach the grounding site at Torhamneskär, the submarine had to navigate through miles of intricate, shallow channels. It had to make precise, hard turns to avoid the outer reefs. The grounding actually occurred the night before, around 8 p.m. on October 27th. They had spent 12 hours deep inside a restricted zone, trying to escape before the sun came up. The Swedish Accident Investigation Commission analyzed the track. To reach Gåsefjärden, the vessel had to pass through a series of narrow straits. While the water is nominally 12 meters deep in the center, the navigable channel is incredibly narrow, flanked by jagged rocks just a few meters below the surface. The draft of a Whiskey-class submarine is 4.6 meters. That leaves almost no margin for lateral error. The investigation concluded that this required active and precise steering. The rudder commands were deliberate. The course corrections were calculated. This was not a vessel adrift. It was a vessel under command, executing a complex infiltration route. The location was a strictly controlled military zone. Foreign nationals were banned. Foreign vessels were prohibited. Even Swedish civilians needed permits to enter certain sectors. By the time the fishermen found her, the S-363 wasn't just lost. She was trapped in the heart of Swedish sovereignty. She was a burglar who had picked the lock, stepped into the hallway, and then tripped over the coffee table. The intruder was a Whiskey-class diesel-electric submarine. The Soviets designated it Project 613. By 1981, this was an old boat. It was a design based on the Nazi-German Type 21 electric boat technology seized after World War II. It was a workhorse, but it was crude. Displacement, 1,030 tons on the surface. Length, 76 meters. Propulsion, two 37D diesel engines producing 2,000 brake horsepower and two electric creeping motors for silent running. Life inside a whiskey was hell. It was cramped, hot, and smelled of diesel, sweat, and cabbage. The crew of 56 men slept in hot bunks, sharing beds and shifts. She wasn't fast, maxing out at 13 knots submerged, but she was heavily armed. In her bow were 4 533mm torpedo tubes, in her stern, 2 more. She carried a complement of 18 torpedoes or 24 mines. But S-363 wasn't just a rust bucket on a routine patrol. When Swedish officers boarded her, they found something strange. The boat was carrying high-ranking personnel, including Captain First Rank Joseph Overkevich, the Chief of Staff of the Submarine Brigade. You don't put a brigade chief of staff on a training run for cadets, you put him on a mission. And that mission coincided perfectly with a secret Swedish naval exercise testing the new Torpedo 42, a sophisticated anti-submarine weapon. S-363 was likely there to record the acoustic signature of the new weapon. She was a spy. When the Swedish naval officers boarded the boat to demand an explanation, the Soviet captain Anatoly Gushin told them a fairy tale. He looked the Swedish investigators in the eye and claimed that every single navigation system on the boat had failed simultaneously. He claimed the gyro compass broke. He claimed the echo sounder broke. He claimed the radio direction finder broke. And he claimed the Decca navigator broke. He claimed due to these failures and severe weather, they believed they were off the coast of Poland. This was a lie of astronomical proportions. The error between their claimed position and their actual position was 50 nautical miles. The Decca navigator system relies on hyperbolic radio navigation. It uses a chain of land-based master and slave stations to create a grid. The receiver measures the phase difference between the signals. Under the conditions present that night, the Decca Mark 21 system would be accurate within 50 to 100 meters. The Swedish investigation tested the local Decca chain. It was fully operational. There was no atmospheric interference. There was no jamming. For the Decca to fail, the receiver would have to be physically smashed, and when the Swedes looked at the unit on the bridge, it was intact. Swedish interrogators later noted that a navigational error of this magnitude was worthy of the Guinness Book of World Records. Furthermore, the forensic examination of the logbooks showed signs of tampering. Entries had been erased, coordinates had been altered. They weren't lost. They knew exactly where they were, right until they hit the rock that wasn't on their chart. By the evening of October 28th, the accident had become a global crisis. The submarine was listing heavily to starboard. The noise of its engines trying to free itself had woken up residents on the nearby islands of Sturkö and Aspo. The Swedish government, led by Prime Minister Thorbjörn Fälldin, faced a nightmare scenario. If they let the boat go, they looked weak, a neutral doormat for the Soviet Union. If they seized the boat, they risked a shooting war with a superpower. But the Swedish military leadership felt something else: vindication. For years, the Swedish Navy had reported strange underwater contacts. The press mocked them. They called these ghost sightings budget boats, claiming the Navy was inventing submarines just to get more money from Parliament. When the report came in from Gåsefjärden, the Swedish Chief of Defense Staff didn't panic. He reportedly slammed his fist on the table and exclaimed, "Finally, the ghost was real and it was parked on a rock." But the stakes were about to get much higher. The Swedish National Defense Research Institute suspected that the S-363 wasn't just carrying conventional torpedoes. They suspected she was carrying the bomb. Rumors began to circulate in the cabinet. If that boat had nuclear weapons, and if it exploded or leaked, the Karlskrona archipelago would be uninhabitable for years. On October 29, 1981, the stakes were about to get much higher. Moscow wasn't sending diplomats. They were sending a sledgehammer. The threat shifted from the grounded boat in the archipelago to the open sea. The Soviet Navy dispatched a rescue task force to the edge of Swedish territorial waters. It was an armada designed to intimidate. Nearly a dozen ships gathered just outside the 12 nautical mile limit. 2 Nanitschka-class missile corvettes, a Riga-class frigate, a heavy ocean-going tugboat, and leading them was the Kashin-class destroyer Obzhratsovy. Carrying Admiral Kalinin, the Obzhratsovy was a hunter. It bristled with surface-to-air missiles and heavy guns. Its mission was ambiguous. Were they there to tow the boat home, or were they there to storm the archipelago and retrieve their nuclear asset by force? The Swedish Supreme Commander, General Lennart Bergqvist, looked at the map and issued a chilling order. He told his coastal forces, if they cross the line, engage with lethal force. Sweden was a neutral country, but on that Tuesday, they loaded the guns. The critical moment came when the Soviet fleet began to push. The ATTRIBUTION turned its bow toward the Swedish coast and accelerated. Hidden deep in the islands was the Swedish coastal artillery battery Ka-2. They had 120mm Bofors guns trained on the channel, but they used a different weapon to send a message. The battery commander watched the Soviet destroyer close the distance. He ordered his fire control radar to engage. He didn't just scan them, he switched the system from search to continuous track. In electronic warfare, there is a massive difference between being watched and being targeted. A search radar sweeps the horizon, a rhythmic pulse every few seconds. But continuous track focuses a narrow, high-intensity beam directly on the target to generate a firing solution. The Swedish radar used frequency hopping, changing its transmission frequency thousands of times per second to burn through jamming. On the bridge of the Soviet destroyer, the electronic support measures would have screamed a lock-on warning. The Soviet admiral knew that this wasn't a search scan. This was the electronic sound of a gun being cocked. The message was clear. We are not bluffing. Turn around or you will sink. The ATTRIBUTION slowed. It held its position. The radar operator had won the first round without firing a shot. The tension didn't just break, it snapped. While the diplomats argued in Stockholm, the Soviet Rescue Task Force, led by the destroyer ATTRIBUTION, began to push the line. They weren't just parking, they were encroaching on the 12-mile territorial limit. The threat was existential. If the Soviet Navy crossed that line, Sweden's neutrality was effectively over. Prime Minister Thorbjörn Fälldin had to make the ultimate decision. He picked up the phone to Supreme Commander Lennart Bergqvist and issued a directive that has become legendary in Swedish history. He didn't ask for a negotiation strategy. He spoke two words, Håll gränsen, hold the border. It was a blank check for war. The order was absolute. If the Soviet fleet crosses the line, sink them. That order turned the Swedish military into a hair-trigger mechanism, and moments later, that trigger was almost pulled by mistake. A violent gale-force storm slammed into the Baltic. Radar images became cluttered with sea clutter, green noise masking the surface. Suddenly, the S-363 fired distress flares into the night sky and broadcasted desperate mayday. To the Swedish command, this looked like a signal to attack. At that exact moment, amidst the storm, radar operators detected two unidentified vessels crossing the 12-mile limit at high speed, heading straight for the submarine. The Swedish command connected the dots. The submarine signals Mayday. Two fast ships break the hold the border line. Conclusion? It's a rescue raid. Soviet commandos are coming in. Swedish Air Force AJ-37 Viggen strike aircraft were scrambled. They were armed with heavy anti-ship missiles. They roared into the storm, minutes away from launching a strike that would have sunk the intruders and started World War III. For 20 minutes, the pilots circled in the rain, fingers on the triggers, waiting for visual confirmation to fire. Then, the reconnaissance report crackled over the radio. The Soviet commandos were two West German merchant ships carrying grain. They were lost in the storm, their radar blinded, just trying to find shelter in the archipelago. The strike was called off with seconds to spare. The hair-trigger reality of 1981 nearly turned a grain shipment into a massacre. As the diplomatic shouting match raged on the surface, a quieter, deadlier conversation was happening in the basements of the Swedish National Defense Research Institute, the FOA. The whiskey class was old, yes, but intelligence suggested these vessels were still part of the Soviet nuclear triad in the Baltic. The Baltic Sea of Peace was Moscow's favorite propaganda slogan. They claimed they never brought nukes into the Baltic, but Swedish intelligence suspected it was a lie. If the S-363 was carrying nuclear weapons inside Swedish territorial waters, the game changed completely.
It would be an act of supreme aggression. It would prove the Soviets were using Sweden as a nuclear parking lot. But you can't just knock on the hatch and ask a Soviet captain if he has an atomic bomb. You have to prove it, and you have to prove it through an inch of high-tensile steel without boarding the ship while Swedish Marines are watching you with machine guns. The FOA needed a way to see the invisible. They needed a way to look through steel.
To catch a nuclear lie, you need gamma ray spectroscopy. The science is absolute. Nuclear weapons use uranium-238 as a tamper. It is a heavy metal cladding wrapped around the fissionable core. Its job is to reflect neutrons back into the core to boost the explosive yield. Uranium-238 is unstable. It is constantly decaying. The decay chain of uranium-238 is a fingerprint. It decays into thorium-234, which then decays into protactinium-234M. This is the key. When protactinium-234M decays, it emits high-energy gamma photons at very specific frequencies, 1.001 MeV and 766 keV. These gamma rays are hard X-rays. Lower energy particles are absorbed by the hull, but the 1.001 MeV photon is powerful enough to punch right through the steel pressure hull of a submarine and the outer hydrodynamic hull. The FOA scientists knew that if they could get a sensitive enough detector close to the hull, they could hear the uranium singing. They deployed high-purity germanium detectors. These aren't standard Geiger counters that just click. These are precision spectrometers capable of measuring the exact energy signature of a single photon. The vehicle for this high-tech sting was the humble Coast Guard boat TV-103. The Swedish authorities contacted the Soviet captain. They claimed they were moving the boat alongside to provide security against heavy weather or to offer diplomatic assistance. It was a lie. It was a Trojan horse. Hidden beneath the deck of the TV-103, shielded by canvas and crates, were the detectors and a team of sweating scientists monitoring liquid nitrogen cooling systems. The Swedish captain maneuvered his vessel skillfully in the choppy water. He drifted along the length of the Soviet submarine, dangerously close to the hull. The scientists below deck watched their monitors. They held their breath. They scanned the stern. Silence, just background radiation. They scanned the midship. Silence. They moved towards the bow, past the conning tower, and then the graphs spiked. The detectors picked up a massive surge of gamma radiation localized specifically to the port side torpedo tubes. The energy signature was unmistakable. It matched the 1.001 MeV peak of protactinium-234M perfectly. Because protactinium exists in secular equilibrium with its parent isotope, detecting it meant that uranium-238 was present in significant quantities. This wasn't trace radiation from a luminous dial watch. This wasn't a depleted uranium keel used for ballast. The intensity of the signal allowed the FOA to estimate the mass. There were several kilograms of uranium-238 sitting inside that tube. There is only one reason to have that much uranium-238 inside a torpedo tube. It was a warhead. The FOA calculations were terrifying. The data suggested the presence of a tactical nuclear torpedo, likely the T-5. The estimated yield was 5 to 10 kilotons. To put that in perspective, the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima was approximately 15 kilotons. This wasn't just a navigational hazard. This was a city killer. If that torpedo detonated, the Karlskrona naval base, the city, and the surrounding islands would be vaporized. On November 5, 1981, Prime Minister Faldin held a press conference that stopped the world.
Det är en allvarlig kränkning av Sveriges suveränitet och territorium. Redan detta att ett främmande örlogsfartyg tränger in på ett militärt skyddsområde. Vad som är ännu allvarligare, och vad jag nu för första gången ger offentlighet åt, det är att enligt de undersökningar som vi har företagit så är den sovjetiska ubåten med stor sannolikhet bestyckad med kärnvapenladdningar. Med ännu större sannolikhet, en sannolikhet som gränsar till visshet, kan det sägas att uran 238 finns ombord. Och ingen har kunnat finna någon annan rimlig användning för detta uran. Detta gör att det här i själva verket rör sig om den mest uppseendeväckande kränkningen mot Sverige sedan andra världskriget.
The secret was out. The Soviets were caught red-handed with a nuclear weapon inside a neutral country's military base. While the fleets postured, the real battle was happening across a formica table on the torpedo boat Västervik. The Swedish interrogation was led by the naval base chief of staff, Captain Carl Anderson. Anderson demanded answers from the Soviet captain, Anatoly Gushchin, but Gushchin wasn't the only one in the room. He was shadowed by Vasily Besedin, the boat's political officer. The Swedish interrogators noticed a disturbing dynamic. Captain Gushchin, the man theoretically in charge of the nuclear vessel, seemed hesitant. He was a broken man. He looked at Besedin before every answer. Besedin was aggressive. He interrupted. He corrected the captain's answers. He signaled when to speak and when to shut up. It became clear that on the S-363, the man driving the boat wasn't the man in charge. The party was in charge. Years later, in 2006, Vasily Besedin revealed the terrifying truth of those days on the rocks. He confirmed that the crew had standing orders to scuttle the submarine if the Swedes attempted to seize it by force. This wasn't just about sinking the boat to hide the codebooks, it was about destroying the evidence. The plan involved battening down the hatches and detonating internal high-explosive charges. The crew would die with the ship. Besedin admitted, "We would have blown ourselves and the boat up rather than surrender." Besedin later claimed the explosion would be like Hiroshima. November 5, 1981. After 10 days of nuclear brinkmanship, the standoff ended. The S-363 was finally pulled off the rocks by Swedish tugs. She floated, battered, humiliated, but intact. She wasn't allowed to leave immediately. For another day, she remained under Swedish control in the outer roads while the final diplomatic papers were signed. Then, on November 6th, she was towed out to the international waterline. The Swedish Navy formally handed her back to the waiting Soviet fleet. She limped back to her base at Liepāja on the Latvian coast. Moscow maintained its poker face. The Soviet Foreign Ministry issued a note denying everything. They admitted only that appropriate markers were on board, but denied violating international law. They stuck to the lie of the broken compass. But the Swedes knew better. They had the gamma ray charts, and they had the coordinates. They knew exactly what had been parked in their garden. The incident changed Sweden forever. It created a national condition known as submarine hysteria. For the next decade, Sweden saw periscopes everywhere. Meteorological buoys, whales, and drifting logs were reported as Soviet intruders. But it also hardened the Swedish resolve. The Navy was authorized to use incident weapons, specifically the Elma anti-submarine grenade. These were small, shaped charge warheads designed to punch a hole in a submarine's pressure hull without sinking it immediately. The goal was to force the intruder to the surface, to bang on the hull until they couldn't breathe. But they also deployed a weapon designed for psychological torture, the Malin. The Elma was a sledgehammer. The Malin was a tracking beacon. It was a magnetic acoustic transmitter. You dropped it on the enemy submarine and it stuck to the steel hull. Once attached, it didn't explode. It screamed. It sent out a piercing rhythmic ping that the Swedish Navy could track anywhere in the Baltic.
For the Soviet crew inside, there was no silence, there was no hiding, just the constant maddening sound of the Malin attached to their skin, broadcasting their position to every hunter in the water. The message was, next time we won't serve coffee, we will serve high explosives and zero privacy. The political fallout was immense. The whiskey on the rocks shattered the Soviet Union's carefully crafted image. Moscow loved to talk about the Baltic Sea of peace. They claimed they wanted a nuclear-free zone. They funded peace movements in the West. But the S-363 proved they were hypocrites. They were sailing nuclear weapons into the harbors of neutral nations. The humiliation of 1981 didn't just anger the generals, it militarized the population. In the weeks following the grounding, a strange phenomenon occurred. The Godsofjeden Insamlingen, or Godsofjeden collection, began. Ordinary Swedish citizens, fishermen, and grandmothers started mailing their own money to the Admiralty. They weren't paying taxes, they were making donations. The message on the checks was simple: buy new ships. The Swedish people were voting with their wallets for a fortress state. This empowered center-right politicians in Sweden, like Carl Bildt, who argued for a stronger military and higher defense spending. Neutrality, they realized, didn't mean pacifism. It meant you had to be strong enough to defend your own borders against a superpower. The grounding of S-363 remains the smoking gun of the Cold War in the Baltic. It was a moment when the invisible war became visible. It showed us the arrogance of a superpower that believed it could redraw maps with a submarine keel. But it also showed us the power of forensic science. The FOA scientists didn't need to board the boat to find the truth. They used physics to peer through the steel and catch a nuclear lie. The S-363 proved that sovereignty isn't just lines on a map. It is the ability to detect, identify, and defend against the shadows lurking beneath the surface. The Cold War officially ended, but the psychological war in the Baltic, that just got weird. In 2015, following a new wave of phantom sub sightings, a Swedish arbitration group decided the depth charges were too old-fashioned. They deployed a new weapon, a weapon designed to exploit the one fear greater than death for a conservative Russian navy. They called it the Singing Sailor. It was an underwater neon sign placed directly in the path of known infiltration routes. It read, "Welcome to Sweden, gay since 1944. But the real weapon was the hydrophone. Just like the Malin tracker from the 80s, it broadcast a continuous signal. But instead of a ping, it tapped out a message in Morse code. This way, if you are gay. The logic is clever. The S-363 crew feared the rocks. The modern crews feared the report they would have to file. It was the ultimate psychological minefield.